tonight is wrap up some of the threads we've talked about, echo some of the themes and images and figures and so forth without hopefully being too redundant. So what I'm talking about is Mobilizing Minds, America's Great War Home Front. So on March 5th, 1917, Woodrow Wilson was inaugurated to his second term as president. In the previous 4 weeks, Germany had announced unrestricted U-boat warfare, and newspapers published excerpts of the Zimmerman telegram that we just heard about. Even though Wilson was narrowly elected in November of 1916 on a platform of having kept Americans out of war, and he delivered a speech in January calling for peace without victory, by March 20th, he and his advisors decided that the nation must go to war. Wilson delivered his war message to Congress then on April 2nd. The president urged the lawmakers to, quote, formally accept the status of belligerent, which had been thrust upon the country. Wilson assured his listeners that disloyalty would be dealt with a firm hand of repression. This is in the war message. It was a fearful thing to lead this great, peaceful people into war, into the most terrible and disastrous of all wars, with civilization itself seeming to be in the balance. Those are Wilson's words. But the war could make the war safe for the war could make the world safe for democracy. It might be the war to end war. 4 days later, April 6th, Congress obliged the president, and America entered the Great War. To fight a modern war like World War I, nations had to mobilize as many resources as they possibly could. These included the usual suspects: manpower, food, money. But I think it's important to remember that minds and hearts also had to be mobilized in order to win a vast global war fought between industrialized nations and empires. So the armed forces, of course, needed manpower. Millions of soldiers voluntarily enlisted, and millions more were drafted after May of 1917. This, of course, was America's first military draft since the Civil War of the 1860s. Although many men were conscripted during World War I, others were persuaded to volunteer. And we've seen some of these posters tonight, but to convince men to fight, the federal government employed artists well-versed in the ways of advertising, which is becoming an art by the 19-teens. Recruitment posters guilted men, of course, into serving by playing on traditional gender norms. Look, even women would serve if they could. Oh, this one, I'd join, if I were a man, I'd join the Navy. I'd do it. Or hey, look, if you don't enlist, innocent women and children will keep dying at the hands of German U-boats. So this is, of course, a reference to the Lusitania and some of the other casualties of U-boat warfare. So you men need to sign up and protect them. Another famous poster that we've already seen tonight, of course, uses paternalism to encourage men to enlist. Here's Uncle Sam, fatherly figure that he is, pointing straight at you, telling you to get your butt down to the nearest recruiting station now, or Dad's not going to be very happy with you. Even if you couldn't enlist, there were other ways to contribute to the war effort. Of course, unlike their counterparts in Europe, Americans did not endure strict rationing during World War I, but they were asked to voluntarily take those wheatless and meatless days that we heard about earlier, leaving those nutritious foodstuffs for soldiers. Americans were also encouraged to turn their yards into so-called victory gardens. When I was a kid, Victory Garden was a show on PBS on Saturday afternoon. It took me a while to figure out that this was actually a thing, right, during the World Wars. And I recall fondly my grandmother, as long as she lived, she had that little stretch of rutabagas and turnips and things like that growing back behind her garage, and that's very much a remnant of her being born in 1916 and then living through World War II in the 1940s. So growing your own food so as much agricultural produce as possible can be shipped off to the soldiers in Europe. So that wage earners would have enough time to work in their gardens in the evenings, America shifted to daylight savings time in 1918. Germany, Britain, and other combatants had already made this switch in 1916, and this odd and rather unnatural, we might say, custom has stuck with us for nearly a century now. My students always love this one, right? Victory, Congress passes daylight saving bill, get your hoe ready, and we've got the happy little dancing clock down here that's so happy that he too can contribute time. Time itself can contribute to the war effort. How to finance the war was a significant topic of discussion in 1917. Would the war be paid for with taxes, or would it be paid for with loans? While some progressive Republicans like Robert M. La Follette, who initially opposes U.S. entry into the war altogether, but once the United States is in the war, La Follette of Wisconsin thinks it's better to pay for the war through taxation. Others, though, thought it was better to fund the war with lending. Woodrow Wilson's Treasury Secretary, William G. McAdoo, was a major proponent of loans. Specifically, McAdoo wanted the American people, not just banks, but the people themselves, to contribute by investing their money in what were called Liberty bonds or Liberty loans. McAdoo later reflected on his approach. He said, quote, "We went direct to the people, and that means to everybody, to businessmen, workmen, farmers, bankers, millionaires, school teachers, laborers." I'm reminded of those nighttime visits, right, that sometimes wouldn't be that friendly. "We capitalized the profound impulse called patriotism. It is the quality of coherence that holds a nation together. It is one of the deepest and most powerful of human motives. To loan money to the nation was patriotic. Not to do so was seen as supremely unpatriotic. Liberty bonds were the cash register of patriotism. In June 1917, McAdoo said that every person who refuses to subscribe or who takes the attitude of let the other fellow do it is a friend of Germany, and I would like nothing better than to tell it to him to his face. A man who can't lend his government $1.25 per week at the rate of 4% interest is not entitled to be an American citizen." That's very, very specific, I might add. You had to volunteer, or you weren't really one of us. And that's, I think, an important idea, right? It's about us versus them. That's nationalism. That's World War I. Americans felt pressure to contribute to the war effort by whichever means they could. And I'd like to turn to a rather unusual example. That's a guy named Karl Graham Fisher. I spent a lot of time thinking about Karl Graham Fisher. Fisher was an Indiana auto parts tycoon who used his fortune that he made in producing the first practical headlamps in the early 1900s to promote good roads and to promote auto racing. In 1909, he and some other Indiana automobile tycoons, they built the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, which hosted automotive and aviation contests starting that summer in 1909. Just before the United States entered the war in March of 1917, Fisher volunteered that massive racetrack, the Indianapolis Motor Speedway, as a facility for training military aviators. By war's end, there's the Indianapolis Motor Speedway. By the war's end, the racetrack was at the center of a large network of aviation fields and facilities spread all throughout the Midwest, from Dayton, Ohio to Rantoul, Illinois. This wasn't the only service the Indianapolis Motor Speedway provided. It also housed Italian aviation engineers named the Pomiglio brothers, who designed and built military aircraft there at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway for the Allies. Meanwhile, just up the road a ways in Detroit, engineers at Packard and Ford were busy developing the lightweight Liberty engines for use in aircraft and other military vehicles. There were over 10,000 of these V-12 Liberty engines produced by American automobile manufacturers during the war. Tangible resources, of course, were very important for winning the war, but so were intangible resources. After all, McAdoo's financing scheme emphasized voluntary support and patriotism, not force, not taxation. A major part of the war effort, therefore, was convincing people that they should want to contribute. Not they had to, but they should want to do this. This is something from inside of themselves. We've already heard a little bit about the Creel Committee, right? On April 13th, 1917, so that's 1 week after American entry, Woodrow Wilson issued an executive order that created that Committee on Public Information, the CPI, led by George Creel. The Creel Committee, of course, used all types of media, newspapers, posters, film, just to name a few, to distribute pro-war propaganda. Although they tried to stick to the facts, at least initially, members of that committee were not hesitant to stretch the facts to get Americans solidly behind the war. Perhaps most famous were those 75,000 so-called 4-Minute Men that we heard about earlier, who traveled around to movie theaters giving patriotic speeches during those moments that it took to change the film reels. They encouraged Americans to contribute to the war effort, especially by buying Liberty bonds. So what we see is that during the war, even popular culture is not immune to this kind of inspired patriotism. George Creel stressed that his job was less about turning Americans against Germany, although the committee certainly did that, than about advertising America to its citizens as well as to other people around the world. Creel even titled his 1920 memoir, How We Advertised America. He opened his account by stating that, quote, "It was the fight for the minds of men, for the conquest of their convictions, and the battle line ran through every home in every country." This isn't a war just about the battlefields. This is verging towards total war, right? It's about everybody in every place. The CPI, said Creel, was the voice created to plead the justice of America's cause before the jury of public opinion. He argued strenuously, perhaps a little too strenuously, that the committee was not a censorship body. Whatever Creel's assertions, it was certainly a propaganda body. In addition to patriotism and voluntarism, mental power also had to be harnessed. This included the nation's universities. We heard a little bit about WT earlier. It's one of a large network of higher education institutions that's contributing to the war. Many university professors had gotten used to the idea of gearing their teaching or research to the service of the state and the service of society during the early 1900s progressive era, and they continued that perspective into the war. The Intercollegiate Intelligence Bureau was established at Washington, D.C. in February of 1917, so even before the war began, or before the United States entered the war, I should say. It formed committees at over 100 American institutions of higher education, seeking out scholars who could contribute to the war effort. Historians contribute their expertise through the National Board for Historical Service, founded in late April of 1917. The NBHS produced scholarship portraying America's relationship with Britain in a favorable light, and showed German culture in a somewhat less favorable light. The NBHS especially geared its message to school teachers, high school teachers especially, who could influence young minds as they are growing. By 1918, also chapters of the Student Army Training Corps, the SATC, had been formed at 525 American colleges and universities, including WT, turning campuses into quasi-officer training facilities. And if that sounds familiar, if you're familiar with the ROTC, my understanding is the ROTC actually starts in 1916, right around the time of the conflict with Mexico, right, to provide officers for that conflict. Psychologists also contributed to the war effort. At Yale, Robert M. Yerkes developed intelligence tests that were intended to determine just how fit young men were for military positions. The alpha and beta tests seemed to show that recent immigrants were less intelligent than those native-born Americans, and thus less fit for military service, although the tests are actually probably better simply at showing how well immigrants have adjusted to American life over time. Such conclusions, though, would contribute to post-war anti-immigrant sentiment after the war, especially the 1924 law that more or less banned immigrants who weren't from Western Europe. 10 years before American entry to World War I, chemists at the University of Kansas were working with helium, an element that had just been discovered in 1895. Although it was known that helium existed in trace amounts in the atmosphere, it was not yet known if it could be processed in large amounts useful for military applications, like for aviation, because of course helium is a lot safer than hydrogen for filling dirigibles and balloons and zeppelins and so forth. At Kansas, scientists like Hamilton Cady stepped up their efforts to devise methods of extracting helium from natural gas during the war. It was too late to really factor significantly in the war effort. This research provided the basis for the post-war helium industry in western Kansas and right here in the Texas Panhandle. Some professors were very enthusiastic about contributing to the war. A few even considered working in shipyards as carpenters or as farmers during the summer to do what they could that wasn't just mental, but actually contributing their labor to the war effort. But others were torn about the conflict and America's role in it. After all, many of them had earned their graduate degrees in German universities. In the late 1800s, if you wanted to be an intellectual, if you wanted to be a professor, you didn't go to Yale or Harvard. You went to Berlin or one of the other major universities in Germany. And so, at the turn of the century, a lot of Americans had seen Germany as a place of culture and a place of learning. Some scholars wrote analyses of the war that tried to stay as balanced as they possibly could. But some professors, like one professor at the University of Minnesota, they were actually fired because they were critical of the war. They lost their pensions, they lost whatever tenure they had earned at those institutions. But others took stories of German atrocities to heart, and they rejected the land where they had once lived and studied. For example, James Henry Breasted, an Egyptologist at the University of Chicago, he stopped corresponding with German colleagues altogether during the war. And in 1917, I love this story, he rebound his old German dictionary and presented it to his enlisted son with a new title, Dictionary of the Enemy's Language. Breasted was not unique in his rejection of the German language. Even though millions of Americans could trace their ancestry to Germany, especially to the migrations of the 1840s, my maternal grandmother is counted amongst that number, German Americans were pressured very much to reject their heritage during the conflict. Many Lutheran churches stopped conducting services in German after April of 1917, including some in my hometown in central Illinois. High schools and colleges gutted their German programs, because after all, it's the enemy's language. You can't be learning the enemy's language in school, while enrollment in French courses actually went up during the war. Considering the recent whole Freedom Fries incident, that I find that to be kind of surprising. But Americans were welcome to speak English, such as in this public park in Chicago, and we saw this image during the PBS video, but they were not supposed to speak German, again, the enemy's language. Food and drink were also adjudicated for their patriotism, or their lack thereof. Some of you may be familiar with sauerkraut becoming Liberty cabbage. And I love this. More German atrocities. We've got sauerkraut, Limburger cheese, and Blutwurst. Dealers think camouflage name is better suited to American suitability. By 1919, of course, German lager beer was a beverage banned by the Prohibition Amendment and then the Comstock Act. Did it really make a difference what pickled cabbage was called or whether children spoke German in a park? Not really. But what Wilson and McAdoo, they had set the tone back in 1917, in April of 1917. Americans were not being forced to contribute, they were pressured to contribute. They were encouraged to contribute. They had to be loyal, they had to volunteer, and if they were not loyal, if they did not volunteer, they faced the consequences of being branded as unpatriotic, as not being real Americans in the conflict as one of us. In a way, changing the name of an everyday food item from a German word to an American word stressing liberty was emblematic of the larger war effort, the same way that rebranding your old German dictionary as a codex of the enemy's language was emblematic of the war effort. Americans were supposed to give their all to the war, their bodies, their food, their money, their time, and perhaps, most importantly, their hearts and their minds. Thank you very much.